Hello YouTube, this is Morgan Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar video. This one is going to be my 2020 Avatar Year in Review. This is going to be the second of 3 videos that I always do at the end of every year to round off the year. So the first one you saw a few weeks ago on the channel, and that was my top 5 story moments for Avatar and Korra from the year 2020. This, as you can see, is going to be the year in review for 2020, and then the last of the 3 videos, which you'll see right towards the end of the year, is going to be my 2021 Avatar Year preview, where we'll look ahead to what we're expecting next year. But here, we're focusing on 2020. It's been quite a year, of course, because of the coronavirus and lots of other stuff, but let's focus in on how was 2020 for Avatar. So let's get straight into how do I typically judge the quality of a year in Avatar. I usually do it based on 3 things. Number 1, new story content released during the year. 2, merchandise released during the year. And 3, key news that came out during the year. I weigh new story content heavily, especially when there's no news that is absolutely massive, and with merchandise I typically treat it as more of a bonus than a thing that makes or breaks a year. But like news, it depends on the specifics. So for instance, if they finally ever get around to announcing that they are going to be releasing the Avatar and Korra soundtrack, that's a big merchandise announcement. That's also a big piece of news, and that would play a major role because we've been waiting for that for so long. That didn't happen this year, but it's just an example of something that would take a piece of news merchandise and put it sort of on the same level as what I typically rate the most highly during the year, and that is the new story content. So yeah, now that we know what we're doing, let's jump into what story content we did actually get this year, and we'll start with the new story content. So 4 things here, but some of these aren't really like the others, as you can probably tell. So, Ruins of the Empire Part 3, right from back from the start of the year in February. The Shadow of Kyoshi, the second Kyoshi novel, the second ever Avatar novel, full stop. Katara and the Pirate Silver, our first Avatar one-shot comic. And then the 3rd Insight Editions, kind of a notebook, scrapbook style book, Legacy of the Fire Nation. These are all the new kind of story related content that came out this year, and immediately I think it's pretty fair to say Legacy of the Fire Nation is a fun book. It's enjoyable. The art is fantastic from Sora Medina, but it ultimately didn't really have any new content in it. This one, especially because it was so Iroh focused, we expected it to have a little bit more, and it more gave the illusion of like it kind of tries to maybe get across that it has new information, but it really doesn't. I recommend people pick it up if you're a collector, but if you just want the new information, it's not quite here. Similarly, the first one-shot comic, Katara and the Pirate Silver, is fine. It's fun, it's entertaining. I like that Katara got to be the focus character in this book, and she's very cool in it, but it's not a particularly notable story. It's very hamstrung by where it is set. Making it set during one of the only points during book 2 where they could set it means that it just limits what you can do with Katara as a character, how much important stuff can actually happen in terms of like time, effect, impact. And while it kind of ends up roughly in the end having some really interesting ideas, it never quite gets the time to explore them or really commit to them, because ultimately, if something this big happened, why wasn't it addressed in any of the episodes? And that was the major weakness that they had to work around by setting it in such a spot. So it was a tough ask, and ultimately a relatively weak way to start off the new era of Avatar comics with these one-shots. I definitely think they should have just set this like post end of the series. That way you immediately open up what you can do with Katara. They didn't need to lock themselves into book 2 so heavily, and that affected the book. Ruins of the Empire Part 3 and Shadow of Kyoshi, on the other hand, were the main story content of the year, and both of them are very good. I'll go with Shadow of Kyoshi first. Quite simply, Shadow of Kyoshi was the best Avatar thing that happened this year. It's the best piece of content from the year, and this is the thing that, made the year, basically. This book on its own, I think, roughly saves the year from being and feeling a little bit average. Because there's pretty much only 2 notable pieces of story content this year, and story content is most of my rating, Shadow of Kyoshi is most of the rating. And the thing is, this time it had a little bit to live up to, because Rise of Kyoshi last year was sort of an unknown content, like our first ever proper Avatar novel. What's it going to be like? It came out, it blew us away. Going into this, we knew what to expect. Like, that book was incredible. How will they follow that up? And in my mind, FCE delivered once again. Sure, there's perhaps a little bit more to critique, just because of like where they chose to end off, and that, like, could you not have done more, open up the door to doing like a third book or whatever. It's 100 pages shorter than the first book, but those kind of minor quibbles aside, they delivered on the Kyoshi character arc, and where that went in this book based off the last one. Yoon developing him very heavily as a character, the Avatar Karuk backstory, all fantastic parts. And then Rangi, of course, was great in this book, in addition to some of the new characters that were introduced. And then, as always, the world building, the details, it's all here. We don't get content this detailed that often, and it was a delight to have this during the year. Runes of the Empire, as sort of the main Dark Horse release this year, was very, very good, because it did what a lot of the recent Dark Horse comics haven't done, and that is that it delivered important content. Kuvira did actually develop in this book. She changes over the course of Runes of the Empire, and especially part 3, from the character that she was at the start. And while it perhaps maybe didn't cover as much ground as some people expected, I think it still deserves praise for doing as much as it did, given that a lot of the other books from around this sort of era of comics haven't done all that much with the characters. And there's always room to come back to Kuvira, to cover more of her dynamic with Sue, cover more of her dynamic with Bataar Jr. And then let's not forget, King Wu had a really impressive arc during this book, especially in part 3, with how he's handling the elections in the Earth Kingdom and the end decision that he ends up making in part 3 as we go forward. That was all great. The weakness probably, as you can see from the cover, is that Mako, Bolin, and Asami were brainwashed for pretty much the whole book, and it meant that it was very limited on what you could do with those characters, because they were kind of mindless zombies for most of the book, and it was kind of another case of just Korra reacting to sort of bad stuff happening to her friends, whereas I think the reverse dynamic would have been a whole lot more interesting overall. But like I said, it was Dark Horse's best book this year, and I would much prefer the books to be like that than I would to be like Katara and the Pirate Silver. I think that's the best thing to say about this overall. So we move from new story content into the reprints, and the reason I have this as a section here is just because of how many there are. Like on the previous slide, there was 2 new Dark Horse books this year, new story content. There are 6 reprint books. That's that's this year when you look at it from Dark Horse, who are typically the ones who sort of dominate the new story content from a year. This year they didn't, and it was more about reprints. So Imbalance and Runes of the Empire got library editions, which is, the pretty standard new format that we're used to at this point. Both very nice books. Dark Horse always do well with their hardcovers. But we got another library edition this year, and that is the Lost Adventures and Team Avatar Tales short story collection library. So those 2 books got collected together for the first time in the big book format with some extras. Very nice book, but again, just a reprint. You know what to expect. The Promise Omnibus and the Search Omnibus got released this year, starting off the omnibus format. Very exciting, actually. This is a really cool new format, and I think in this year, where Avatar got suddenly very, very popular because of a piece of news we'll cover. These were very welcomed this year and actually quite needed to get the books out to people who wanted them. I really like the omnibus format. I like it that it's this kind of cheap 3-in-1. The book's not overly big. It features most of the extras. To me, it's the best of both worlds. You get the nice form factor of the individual parts, but it's the 3 books in one, and you get pretty much everything that's notable from the library edition. So really like this. And there's going to be the bonus of, if you get all the omnibus editions, the spines will make an image across them. So that's really cool. Last reprint is the art book. Got a reprint, a 2nd edition, because there was some new content in this, but it doesn't really change the nature of the book all that much. It feels like it was just added in so that there would be some reason for people who already have the first version of it to get it. But notably, this is where the deluxe edition comes in, the one with the slipcase, the lithograph and stuff like that. I have a review up on the channel if you want to check it out. Very, very expensive if you go for the deluxe edition, and ultimately I wouldn't particularly recommend it unless you are a hardcore Avatar merchandise collector. Otherwise, like, if you don't have the art book, the standard edition 2nd art book is great. The deluxe edition, I think, is only for a very select amount of people, though. But, you know, lots of books from Dark Horse. Their big books are great, so, you know, that's one thing to say. The last thing in story content this year that's unique, audiobooks. Rise of Kyoshi came out last year, and it was a bit of a surprise that there wasn't an audiobook, and there was definitely some demand for one. And this year we got an audiobook for both The Rise of Kyoshi and The Shadow of Kyoshi, which was really, really fun. That we had the audiobook for the first book going into the second one. I really liked the narrator that we got. She did a great job across both books. So this, just as a new format, a different way to experience these books, is fantastic. Especially for people who perhaps don't have the time to sit down and read 300-400 page book. Having it read to you audiobook style is a great way to experience it. So very fun, and almost a thing from the year that you forget happened, but you know, it's there if you need it. That these two are available in audiobook. So very cool. And hopefully, as we get new novels announced, potentially we'll continue to get audiobooks, which would be cool. Next, we move into merchandise. And so the first thing I'll just quickly cover is this. The Avatar Steelbook Blu-ray got announced and released. This is a kind of limited edition product. They only made 10,000 of them. It's just fancy packaging, basically. It's the exact same Blu-ray as the standard Blu-ray in terms of what's on the discs. It's just some fancy packaging, steel books for the individual kind of bits, and there's cool art on the steel books. It is very nice art, but you are paying extra money because it's limited and packaging. And the fact that, like, the retail price of this is like, what, $98 is pretty crazy. Now, obviously it's being sold on Amazon for more like $70 now, and the fact that it's still in stock like quite a bit later is kind of very telling about the whole situation. But it is something that happened this year, and obviously the Korra one got announced this year for release next year. You know, it's there if you want it. Again, it seems like if you're a hardcore collector who sort of needs everything Avatar and Korra, it's there for you, but you don't need to go out of your way to grab this just because it's new. It's probably the best thing to say about it, but, you know, always nice that they're keeping the Blu-ray in print or whatever. Moving more into the figure side of things, Funko Pops obviously made their debut last year with the first wave of Avatar Funkos and a few exclusives. This year it was Korra's turn. So we got the 4 standard Korra Funko Pops, Korra, Mako, Asami, and Amon, in addition to 1 limited edition Korra in the Avatar state pop. And then there was 1 Avatar pop, that being Book 3 Zuko from Box Lunch. So hopefully we'll get more of these announced as we go forward. There's already been, I think, a few rumors this year about other ones coming, but the impression that I got is that they sold very well this year, and given how popular everything was, people were definitely buying the Funko Pops after the whole Netflix situation. So I highly expect we'll see more Funko Pops get announced. And again, the thing with Funko Pops is that they basically sell them everywhere, so it's probably the most readily available Avatar merchandise. And yes, I know not everyone likes the design, but they do a decent job to try and make them look like the characters, and they're fun. They're not particularly expensive. Yes, the exclusives can be a little bit of a chore to get, but if you keep your eyes open, you can typically get them for not too high prices. So I appreciate that we have Funkos here just to have very, very mass market merchandise available. For the more accurate style figures, we had Diamond Select, I suppose, probably make their debut this year. A lot of the announcements of this was made last year, but they actually came out this year. So Wave 1 of the action figures along the bottom, Book 3 Zuko, Book 3 Aang, and Book 1 Katara started us off. And then right towards the end of the year, we got Wave 2, which is Book 1 Aang and Azula. You know, their figures are nice in that they look like the characters, and they do a decent job with, you know, the accessories and stuff like that. The main problem I'd have with them is just that as action figures, they're not the easiest to use. Like, they're not the most effective action figures in that they look good just sort of standing there, but not a lot of the articulation is particularly usable. Some of the costumes do get in the way of the movement, and some of the joints could be designed a little bit better, but they look pretty accurate, and that's kind of what you want. And so, good first attempt, first company making Avatar action figures, you have to be, I think, more positive than negative about what they've done so far. And the fact that they've announced that they're doing at least up until Wave 6 means we'll, I suppose, eventually get into some of the more obscure characters who haven't received an action figure ever before. Because I suppose the notable thing here is first ever Katara action figure, first ever Azula action figure. Like right here, if you're not including the Funko Pops of them. Because of course the original toy line didn't feature any female characters. So, you know, the Katara was kind of a little bit of an event when it came out. And that has to be noted. The other thing that Diamond Select had is that they announced, I suppose they released and then announced another PVC statue or diorama, whatever way you want to call it. The first one here is the Aang. I have mine on order. It hasn't come in yet, but just from the pictures, it looks fantastic, especially for the price point that it's at. $50 for something that looks this good and is pretty big seems like ideal. That seems like a nice price point where it's not going to be this tiny statue, but you're not going into like $250 statues or whatever, like that Korasami one from a year or two ago. So overall, I've got to say, I like what Diamond Select is doing, and given that next year and onwards, they will have competition up against other companies making action figures, hopefully they put in the effort to make themselves stand out, and their figures will get better and better. I like that they were the first ones to go out and try this, and we'll see what happens going forward with them. In terms of other merchandise, obviously this year I didn't really focus too much on Zen Monkey Studios because they weren't particularly accessible for international fans. Just this is probably a case where COVID hit them pretty hard, and they weren't really able to offer decent shipping for international fans, focusing more on US fans, I guess. It just wasn't really effective for me to be able to order pins this year because it was, as far as I'm aware, anytime I went to make an order, it was like default shipping is $20. And given with customs and stuff like that, I pretty much I don't want to get hit by customs, so can't really order a pin with that pricing. So that's why I didn't really focus on Zen Monkey this year. Hopefully things will settle down as we go into next year. Similarly, Box Lunch, they don't ship internationally as far as I'm aware, but if you want a lot of general merchandise like t-shirts and stuff like that, they have them, and they're always updating with new stuff as well. It's just not the sort of stuff that I cover because it's pretty, standard merchandise, not particularly notable. And then the last section of the video, notable news from the year. So I typically always cover delays. This year, not all about Dark Horse delays. In past years, this section has always been, what are you doing, Dark Horse? Like, why did this book get a 2-month delay? Why did this book get a 1-month delay? Why did you delay that book by like 9 months out of nowhere? Why is every book like being pushed back by like a week or two here or there, and you're not explaining any of it? This year, given that COVID was here for pretty much most of it, it was kind of surprising to see, and good to see, that all of their books pretty much stuck to their release dates, and anything that did change did only change by potentially a week or two. And maybe some books for 2021 were pushed back, say, a month from when they initially announced it. But because they only announced it very recently for a 2021 release date, it's fine that you only changed the date so in such a small way. So it felt like, Dark Horse did well to not have everything be super heavily affected by COVID. And I don't really think that many of the books that are scheduled for early 2021 were ever really meant to come out at like the end of this year. So Dark Horse actually were pretty good this year. But to make up for the lack of delays this year, Abrams Books and Blackstone Publishing stepped up. Abrams Books delaying the paperback of The Rise of Kyoshi by over a year. When the paperback probably would have sold a lot if it had released on its original release date, because after the success of Avatar due to Netflix, everyone was getting into the comics, everyone was getting into the novels, and at least for a while, as far as I'm aware, the hardcover, the original version of The Rise of Kyoshi was very difficult to find for quite a while. So the paperback could have really helped increase sales of the book and done much better than I suppose a standard paperback release of a book you would have thought it would have done. So I think they kind of missed out by delaying it until next year. I get it probably was to prioritize new books, but you probably could have done with actually getting that out. And now we're in a situation where I think the paperback for both Kyoshi novels are coming out on the same day next year, which is kind of weird. And then Blackstone Publishing, this is probably the funniest but also kind of most frustrating delay of the year. They completely botched the release of the Rise of Kyoshi audiobook. They delayed it like the night before it was meant to release, saying that we haven't got approval for the cover of the audiobook, which is just like a square image of the cover. And everyone was just kind of like, what? That's why you delayed it? And then it turns out most of the other places that sell audiobooks that isn't Audible actually just had it up to rent or buy, and it was really only delayed on Audible or like one or two of the main places you get audiobooks from. So it was a complete mess, and that people could still like listen to it. And then once they realized other places were actually releasing it, they sort of had them reverse the fact that they released it, and it was a whole mess. And then eventually, like, the cover finally released, and it was just a square version of the cover, and it was just like, was that so difficult? And then there was really no issue with the Shadow of Kyoshi audiobook. I believe it was some sort of a weird situation where, like, the Shadow of Kyoshi audiobook, like, if you go by like their official release date when the books were actually came out, the Shadow of Kyoshi audiobook technically released before the Rise of Kyoshi audiobook on Audible. It was this really funny situation that they ended up creating. Yeah, surprisingly, like, COVID didn't really lead to too many delays this year. I'd say probably the most affected probably was Diamond Select right at the end of the year. And I think even that is probably just due to like COVID during Christmas. So already things are postage systems overloaded due to Christmas, and then because it's of COVID, you saw like stuff like that shipping actual like physical merchandise like that. That's why the Aang statue in Wave 2 was probably the most heavily affected by it. So yeah, not too bad considering the year on delays. Next piece of news: action figures coming from McFarlane Toys, Loyal Subjects, and Mego. And McFarlane are going to be the first to do Korra action figures. So this was a pretty exciting piece of news, because all of this more or less came boom, 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 one after the other a few weeks ago. So McFarlane Toys is probably the most notable thing out of this. Diamond Select are going to have proper competition for Avatar action figures from McFarlane. I think a lot of people have confidence that McFarlane will do a better job than Diamond Select, but we'll see what exactly they do. They definitely have a bonus with the fact that they're going to be doing Korra figures as well, and of all of these companies now making Avatar action figures, only McFarlane seem to be doing Korra figures. Now, loyal subjects look like they're only going to be doing like a couple of figures. It's not like they are doing a full-on Avatar lineup of figures. It's just they are including Avatar as one of the franchises in one of their general action figure lines, and Mego is doing one figure as far as we're aware. Again, I suppose we'll get all the details of this next year, which is why, as exciting as this news is, the fact that I have no pictures to go along with this, because none of these companies like announced anything beyond that they have acquired the license, is the main thing to say. Next is probably the big piece of news that is for some people going to be like, this year was incredible because this happened. Other people it's going to be like, why is everyone freaking out about the Netflix thing? Like, cool, Avatar came on Netflix. Was it really that big of a deal? I think this is an important piece of news, but I don't think it is so big that it's the best thing ever. This is why 2020 was exceptional as a year for Avatar, is because it came back to Netflix. Not quite. So let's go through this. So Avatar: The Last Airbender and Legend of Korra come back to Netflix and reignite the popularity of the franchise. So Avatar came along first, released on Netflix in America, and the fandom sort of just exploded again. A lot of people got back into Avatar. A lot of people discovered Avatar for the first time. I think lockdown actually really helped this work. Avatar was top of the charts on Netflix for quite a while. I think it broke a record or two, and everyone was talking about Avatar. I saw a massive boost to my numbers on my channel during the couple of months of Avatar and Korra being released on Netflix. But that popularity resurgence did die down after a while. It didn't last the whole year, but what it did result in was, like I said earlier on, a lot of people wanting to get into the Avatar and Korra comics, check out the Kyoshi novels, buy the Funko Pops. Some of the stuff that was released this year did really, really well because you had like double the fan base just because the show came back to Netflix. And I didn't think that the show just coming onto Netflix was going to change things that much. That from my perspective as someone who has the show on DVD, Blu-ray, I have no problem accessing the show at all. And I think Avatar was already on UK and Ireland Netflix. So it really wasn't a piece of news that affected me that much. But it really showed that, these streaming services are it when it comes to sort of, something being popular. That a show from 2005 to 2008 can come back and dominate Netflix, which has all these original shows. They can do roughly the same with a show from 2012 to 2014. And again, it does very similarly on the platform. Both shows, being popular in the year 2020. That was fantastic to see. And it was cool to see all the new people get involved and what they had to say. But does just a lot of new people discovering the show mean that this was a fantastic year to be in the fandom? I don't think necessarily, because I suppose from my perspective as someone who has been in the fandom this whole time, I didn't just come back into it this year. This was okay, cool, popularity spike, great, more people talking about Avatar, but ultimately the main effect that I really saw of this was just that okay, a lot of people making reaction videos to the show on YouTube, which is great. But when you see your 40th one, it's not as big as maybe you think it is. And this is one where it's more I think we will see the result of just how popular everyone now realizes Avatar and Korra are more going into next year. I think we saw stuff like McFarlane, all the toy companies get the Avatar license, partly because of this Netflix popularity and how widespread it was known that, wow, Avatar's on Netflix and it's doing really well. I think we'll see a lot of reaction to that going forward. I think we already have with some of the other book announcements that we got during the year, like the kind of Screen Comics thing and the Avatar cookbook coming out next year. All that stuff, I think, is a direct result of more or less the Netflix popularity. Next piece of news, though. Mike and Brian leave the live-action Netflix show and completely distance themselves from the project. I consider this to be a positive piece of news. It was so interesting, sort of out of nowhere, to just see them both at the same time post on social media this big statement: we're leaving the show. And you read the full details and you realize that, okay, once again, this was them being put in a higher position, but ultimately not being given sort of the ability to direct the project in the way they wanted to. And instead of staying on board with, and have things go awry, they decided to step back, given that it wasn't going the way they wanted it to. They don't want their names attached to something that they don't believe in, and they left. And the fact that they did leave, and they made such a statement that it's not just, we're no longer working on it, the fact that they wished the people well who they met working on the project, but ultimately they said, what you will see in the end is not our work. It is not related to us. Completely backing away. I think that's very telling that they did that. And for me, why I consider it to be such a positive thing is just that I had a lot of worries about the future of the direction of the franchise while Mike and Brian were still attached to this show, because I felt like this was not the direction the franchise needed, was a live action, like basically adaptation of ATLA. I didn't get why we were doing such a big budget adaptation of something that was already so amazing. And especially with how popular Avatar was on Netflix, the idea that you're going to follow that up by basically doing the same thing, but probably realistically never going to be able to capture the same level of popularity. It felt like a losing effort from the get-go. And the fact that they said stuff like, oh, we're going to make this, we're going to expand on what we did in the animated show. I just, red flags going up of like, what do we do with that information, that there's actually going to be like new content related to ATLA in the live action show? What does that mean regards to like the main continuity? Now, Mike and Brian aren't involved. The whole what is canon suddenly doesn't mean anything anymore. And this project, the fact that live action Avatar on Netflix is still going ahead, is something I can completely back away from. Like Mike and Brian, if it's good, fine. If it's terrible, we were never really invested in it in the first place. It can just be this thing completely out there on its own, like The Last Airbender movie. Whereas with Mike and Brian involved in such a big role, directly working on the show, there was always that, like, it is directly attached to the fan base and everything that we're doing, that this is the big project the creators are on. Now, they're not working on that, and in both of their statements they said they're excited to work on Avatar going forward, which I guess means the comics, novels, or who knows what else. It's going to be interesting to see, again, in 2021 or whatever, the result of what are Mike and Brian working on right now because of this next piece of news. Avatar: The Last Airbender comics have a new sandbox-style approach to telling stories. The move away from trilogies came from Mike and Brian, meaning Avatar comics are only one-shots for the next while. This is very interesting. We had to wait a while during the year. We went completely through the announcement and release of Katara and the Pirate Silver. We had the announcement of Toph Beifong's Metal Bending Academy, and we still didn't really know what's going on here. Are we doing trilogies anymore? What is the idea of these one-shots? Then finally they told us, this is the new style. We're not doing any more trilogies to follow up in balance, at least for the next while. Instead, we've got this new sandbox style approach. We're doing these one-shots. Here's the first two, and then we recently got the third one announced, which I'll cover next. And Mike and Brian were the ones who told us to go in this direction. And it's kind of like, wait, why? But then you realize, Katara and the Pirate Silver only recently released. Comics take months and months and months to put together. this was a statement that came from Mike and Brian before they left the Netflix show. So the big question is, they've left it now. Where does that leave the comics going forward now that likely Mike and Brian are working on them again? How many more one-shots are we going to get before we switch back to important content, or what? There's a lot of interesting stuff. And that's why I kind of say that a lot of the news from this year is more of, we'll see in 2021 what comes of this. That it doesn't really have an impact on 2020 itself, but is more of a like, oh, this could lead to something. And that's kind of like everything for me really this year. Of just like, oh, maybe we'll see something happen because of this or whatever. So yeah, continuing on from that, Suki Alone. They announced the third one-shot comic, and for me, I put this down as a notable piece of news, even though it's a product announcement, because the first two one-shots to me gave the impression that, look, this potentially isn't really what we need right now. The Katara comic really didn't deliver, as I talked about. The Toph comic didn't really look like it was kind of going to deliver that much, but it looked like an improvement. This, as a third one, focusing on Suki, is exactly what they needed to do. Give the characters who aren't the absolute main characters the spotlight and fill in the gaps in their stories. You don't need to fill in the tiny, unimportant gaps for like the absolute main characters like they did with the Katara comic. This makes much more sense for Suki, who comes and goes, in that there's over a season between her appearance in book 1 and in book 2. Then obviously she appears in 2 episodes in book 2, of course, because she's in the Serpent's Pass, and then she's in Appa's Lost Days as well. But then there's a gap of a season once again between that and her appearing in The Boiling Rock. Then she's part of the team going forward and is more heavily involved in the comics. Here is all of a sudden a character where there's lots of interesting gaps to cover. What's her backstory? What's going on with Suki in between this point and this point? And in this case, they've chosen to cover what did she get up to in the Boiling Rock before Sokka came in and the full rescue attempt happened. Really, really interesting, especially with whatever the whole Kyoshi kind of spirit thing is. If they're actually going to do anything with Kyoshi in this comic. So I sum this up as Suki Alone announcement shows a step in the right direction for the one-shot comics. I had a lot of doubts about this format, but the Suki announcement gave me hope that going forward things will be better and that everything won't be like the Katara comic and they'll hopefully be more like this one. So that pretty much covers all the details here. So in conclusion, like last year, a year saved from being rather average by our second Avatar novel, The Shadow of Kyoshi. Dark Horse's weak lineup of new storybooks was notable, especially with another year of poor communication as to the future and direction of the comics. A lot of this news, while exciting, had little impact on this year and will likely have more meaning as we move into 2021, when we will see the results of the Netflix popularity and Mike and Brian free to work on other projects. So I think that's the thing. The news this year, some of it was actually quite big, but big in the sense that we'll probably see what happens because of it next year. So I don't think any of the news this year was like quite so big that it makes me go, yes, 2020 was incredible. The Netflix kind of resurgence of popularity is kind of like an interesting kind of one in the middle, where I don't think it should just be dismissed as like, wow, the show came back to a streaming platform, fantastic, and more like, but I also don't think it's the biggest thing ever to happen that just, okay, it brought a lot of people in. I think, it created a lot of the things that happened towards the end of the year and will be big going forward. So it's kind of like a kind of midway important news announcement. But the other thing here is just that, again, without the novel, this year I think would be rather average. The Shadow of Kyoshi really turns this from being an average year into a above average year, just because of how much content is in an Avatar novel. And it makes me worry a lot for like next year, which probably won't have a novel, realistically won't, just because of how long it's going to take to put together, and the fact that we've heard nothing about a third Avatar novel, or whatever they're doing, a different series or whatever. We've heard absolutely nothing. So right now, there were 2 Avatar novels. One came out last year, happened to come out last year, and one happened to come out this year, and they made the last 2 years pretty good. We won't have that to back up the years going forward until they announce something. That is something quite important to look at, that we might really look at 2021 and be like, wow, we really missed the novel. Now that we have had novels and had that experience, it's going to be so interesting to see how a year goes without one. And I think that's where I'll wrap it up. So yeah, I want to just, again, reiterate, in general, really positive year with the merchandise, solid amount of news, and with a novel, it's hard to say the story content was terrible, but Dark Horse specifically, I don't think quite delivered this year. It felt like there was a lot of delays, a lot of waiting, and especially when it comes to the announcement of Korra comics, that was a very frustrating thing, I think, throughout the year. We finished our last series in February. In my mind, they started teasing the next Korra comic in March, where they basically referenced future Korra comics, and still, as of the recording of this video, December 16th, they have not announced what the next Korra comic is. We've been waiting ages for it. I hope that announcement delivers once it happens. So in the comments, let me know what your thoughts were on 2020 as a year in Avatar. What are your thoughts on what I had to say here? Is there anything from the year that I left out that for you was a major part of the year? Yeah, that's been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.